Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Ruby Rogues podcast. This week on our panel, we have John Epperson.
Hello, everybody.
Valentino Stoll.
Hey there.
Dave Kimura.
Hey, everyone.
Luke Stutters.
Hello.
I'm Charles Max Wood from Top End Devs, and this week we are back with, I always struggle saying your name, I'm sorry, Maciej Mensfeld.
Yes, that's correct. Hi, everyone.
Do you want to just introduce yourself? It's been a little while since we've had you on the show.
Couple of years, right?
Yep.
I'm Maciej Mensfeld. I do Ruby and security and Kafka. So that's pretty much all that I spend my time on.
Hey folks, this is Charles Max Wood from Top End Devs, and lately I've been working on actually building out Top End Devs. If you're interested, you can go to topenddevs.com/podcast, and you can actually hear a little bit more about my story, about why I'm doing what I'm doing with Top End Devs, why I changed it from devchat.tv to Top End Devs. But what I really want to get into is that I have decided that I'm going to build the platform that I always wished I had with devchat.tv, and I renamed it to Top End Devs because I want to give you the resources that are going to help you to build the career that you want, right? So whether you want to be an influencer in tech, whether you want to go and just max out your salary and then go live a lifestyle with your family, your friends, or just traveling the world or whatever, I want to give you the resources that are going to help you do that. We're going to have career and leadership resources in there, and we're going to be giving you content on a regular basis to help you level up and max out your career. So go check it out at topenddevs.com. If you sign up before my birthday, that's December 14th. If you sign up before my birthday, you can get 50% off the lifetime of your subscription. Once again, that's topenddevs.com. Cool. So where do we start? Security or Kafka?
Well, I think we can start with what made you invite me again, which is the article I wrote a couple of months ago, right?
Right. Sure. Do you want to kind of give us the 10,000-foot view on that? And then we'll kind of take it from there.
Yeah, sure. So recently, that is for at least 2 years now, I've been rewriting the Karafka framework, the Kafka framework for Ruby that I do. I figured out it was not of the highest quality, it didn't met all of my expectations, and I decided to make it a bit better by rewriting everything. And one of the things that you need to consider is whether you want to have something that is multi-threaded, even in Ruby, or single-threaded. Obviously, single-threaded software is much easier to build. It is much easier to maintain, but it's not as performant, especially if you take into consideration that in Ruby and in Rails, we do a lot of I/O stuff. If we do I/O stuff, we can parallelize certain pieces of work. And Kafka is remarkably good at providing you data that you can work with in parallel. So I've been looking into ways to make sure that within the Karafka framework, that I can provide all of the warranties that are expected when you start working with Kafka, but at the same time that I can do work in parallel. It was inspired by a lot of work that Samuel Williams does from Ruby core team. He's been a huge help to me.
Cool. So do you want to just remind us, because I think it's been like 3 years since we had you on the show. Do you want to just remind everybody what Kafka is and what it does? And then we can kind of grow from there.
It's a distributed event log, and people consider it a queue. And people that know Kafka tend to be offended by that. I see it as a message bus, as a way of you standardizing a standardized way to exchange events that occurred in a system, right? So it isn't a message bus or a job queue. It isn't a job queue because you shouldn't use it that way. Although people use that, you shouldn't use it that way. When you work with Kafka, you should broadcast events on what happened in your system, right? You don't expect it to handle things like do something, but you expect it to store information about things that happened. And if you do it that way, you can get pretty far and you can build really scalable applications. It is really fast. It works in scale, and it isn't as big of a burden in terms of maintenance as it used to be years ago.
Right. So,
and it doesn't use Redis, which is a huge plus.
Yeah, and soon it's not going to use Zookeeper.
So I guess my other question is what kinds of things are people doing with Kafka? Like, do you have an example of where you're using it, or a company you know is using Kafka and Karafka?
Yeah. So Cookpad. Do you know Cookpad? the company from Japan,
Yes.
kind of involved in Ruby. So they're heavy Karafka and Kafka users. To extent of my knowledge, I know that they're streaming exactly what I told you about events, about things that happened in their system, and other parts of the system are consuming it to provide certain values, to provide some like different updates, to take certain actions on events that happened. Right? You can build up independent components, even if it's a monolithic application. You can build up independent components that do only a single thing, and they have a decent scale. And in their scale, it works well. Once they invited me to just help them out with some stuff, it's pretty much fun, pretty fun. So another company that uses Kafka heavily and Karafka is a company I used to work in. Castle, it's a security company. They handle, I don't know how many requests per second they handle now, but they used to handle up to 50,000 requests per second with a Rails app. And we used to consume all of that with a single Ruby process, eating up messages from Kafka. So
50,000 requests a second with a single process.
Yeah. We had, technically speaking, we had two of them, and one was for redundancy in case the first one would hang. You can do a lot of things and you can do it really fast, but you just need to know what you're doing, right? And it often depends on the way your system is built, the way you think. One of the biggest challenges that I have when talking with people about Kafka or Karafka is the Rails mindset. People tend to think with entities. They have a user, they persist it. They have a second user, they persist the changes on it one after another. They don't think in batches. They don't think, okay, I have 100 users. I'm going to do something in memory. I'm going to buffer that. I'm going to get a second batch. I'm going to buffer that. And once I have enough data, I'm just going to flush it using some sort of a upsert, on duplicate key ignore and things like that, like elevating certain databases features to make things 100 times faster, 1000 times faster. Often you don't even need to go to a database. A great example of something like that is when you have a lot of updates. Let's say you need to keep track of last CNET on a website. That's a pretty common feature. And the typical approach with Rails is that you have a before action. Yeah, it's called before action. You have a before action, and whenever you have a user, you just touch the user. Let's talk with the Rails Active Record API. You touch the user to pump the data. The problem is if you have a lot of users and if you have API-based users that make 1,000 queries a second or, even 100 queries a second, you kind of you kind of bump that all the time. But you could easily flush all of the user activities into Kafka. You could eat that up in Kafka. You could have a rolling window of, a minute. And then you would reduce all of this noise into a single query. And then you kind of batch all of the user updates and you have a single query instead of having like hundreds of thousands of them. And this is how we use this approach to reduce the number of queries in one of the systems by 92%. We switched from per entity operations to doing this in batches. Obviously, you lose a bit on the granularity of the updates, but let's be honest. Most of the time, you don't really care if something happened 10 seconds ago or 20 seconds ago or a minute ago. It's a good enough accuracy. So yeah, pretty much if you do a lot of stuff with a lot of data, Kafka can be a huge benefit, but it's not as easy as people think.
Yeah, I know that I have definitely been at a place where people reached for it like really early in the process when the place was really slow and ended up being a hurdle. It made sense later on, but it was definitely a lot of maintenance. Mm-hmm. But I mean, you can do that with any tool. So I guess, so I also wanted to ask in following up to that. So so we used Kafka before and we used Karafka at the time. What exactly is making this one like so much faster? And like, what am I getting faster on? Like, am I just straight up 10 times faster everywhere on anything that I do? Or do I need to have like tons of data going into the system? Like, why is it faster, I guess?
So if you have a single process doing all of the work, it doesn't really matter, right? You don't have to make it faster because one process is enough. And it gets more interesting if you have a bigger system that you need to scale. If you have multiple topics with multiple partitions, topics and partitions are kind of like message queues and sub-message queues within the queues with certain delivery warranties. If you have a lot of partitions, a lot of messages, a lot of topics, basically a lot of data, you tend to have more processes than one. And this means two things. You need to pay more. And in case of a data spike, or in case you need to reprocess certain pieces of data, it may take a lot of time. Also, if you do a deployment, if something goes wrong, you put part of the system down, you put it back online in 2 hours, you need to catch up, right? You need to catch up, and at the same time, you're getting new messages, which means that you're kind of lagging on everything. New Karafka is multi-threaded, pretty much like Sidekick. So as long as it can, it will do its best to run things in parallel in multiple threads. So if you're consuming more than a single partition of a single topic, it will parallelize the work. Obviously, for a CPU intense work, not much is going to happen. You're going to get 0.1% of a difference. It may be even a bit slower. But as long as you do any type of I/O operations, whether you dispatch webhooks, read from a database, write to a database, even write to a file, it's gonna make things significantly faster. I'm also working on a feature where you will be able to parallelize work from a single topic partition. I call it virtual partitions, but it's still under development. I have a couple features under development still for 2.0.
Okay, that's cool. The example that I was thinking of was a distributed kind of like microservices app. And so it was totally doing, a lot of message passing around, in various topics. So that makes some sense that it would benefit at least somewhat from this.
It does batches too, big batches.
Yeah, well, as big as you would want, so as long as you have enough memory to fit it. One really cool feature, two features of Karafka that I really like is obviously batches. Karafka 2.0 handles only batches. It doesn't handle single messages. Though you can force it to have batches of size 1 if you really, really want to. But the second thing is something I call lazy deserialization. So usually you get some sort of a data as a binary stream, right? It's a unserialized string, JSON string, for example, right? Or any Apache Avro, which is partially JSON, XML, whatever. Until you really need the data to be deserialized, it isn't. And it saves a lot of CPU because you can often skip messages based on their headers or based on their raw payload. And that allows you to make things much faster.
Hang on.
I did try using Raptors in 3.1 to make data deserialization happen on multiple cores or multiple CPUs. It worked great until it didn't. And when it didn't, it would just crash the whole Ruby VM. So once every 1 million messages, it would just crash the VM. Not production ready. No, definitely not.
That would be fine for Netflix.
Hard to say. I think we're not there yet with Raptors. Will we ever be? I don't know. Will we need them? That's the next question.
That's where I want Raptors to be used, in third-party libraries or gems that are maintained by very smart people like you that are going to be able to handle that kind of stuff, so I don't have to do it. Because I know in my application, if I were to bring in Raptors or a lot of, quote, thread safety stuff, I'm just going to have race condition after race condition. So I want to leave that stuff to the experts.
I agree. Any type of concurrency should be abstracted away from the end users. They should benefit from it, but they shouldn't be aware of it, or they shouldn't have to do anything special. And this is what Rails actually introduced, right? This engine for running parallel independent queries. I think it got merged with 7. something or 6. something. It seems okay. It kind of violates what you said, because you need to take an action. You need to declare that, hey, I wanted to run it in a background thread. I want to run it explicitly as something. So I still think there's a space for improvements where things happen completely without any user interactions in that regard. But it's a good step forward.
Before we get too far away from the Kafka topic, because I have quite a few questions here. We use Kafka pretty extensively at Doximity, mostly for like data syncing between apps, kind of as the message bus and then process it later. But I'm curious if you could just explain real quick what the maybe differences of that your library, how it's different from maybe Arty Kafka or Ruby Kafka or some of the other Kafka libraries that are out there, and maybe what advantages that it provides over those.
So it uses libRD Kafka, the C library under the hood. It's written by a guy with GitHub handler Eden Hill, and at the moment all the high-level libraries are switching to it because it's thread safe, it's reliable, it's well-tested, and because everyone uses it, we can consider bugs to be detected and fixed. So I used to use something called Ruby Kafka written by Zendesk. I was maintaining some of it, patching it, but it's not of the quality I would expect it to be. And even the author of it decided at some point that, okay, it's just not worth maintaining in the long run. Let's just switch to libRD Kafka. What you've mentioned is our low-level libraries. It's like taking Rack with Puma and building all of the things yourself, just parsing HTTP and doing all of those things by yourself. Or you can take a tool that is a plug-and-play one that allows you to focus on your business logic. And this is where Karafka comes in. You don't have to worry about what is rebalancing, about corner cases of handling data, about handling retries, pausing, exceptions, making work parallel, because libRD Kafka pretty much gives you a way to fetch messages, but it doesn't tell you how to process them. So it's going to give you a lot of messages from a lot of topics and a lot of partitions, but it's up to you to decide whether you want to process that in parallel or whether you want to do it just, one after another. And with Kafka, you don't have to worry. You just define how many worker threads you want. And as I said, it is going to do its best to help you parallelize the work. There are always corner cases, and there are places where without extensive knowledge, you may be better just doing one thing at a time. But I think that for 95, 98% of cases, it's a plug and play, fire and forget type of thing. Why is it better than other frameworks in the Ruby space for Kafka? First of all, not me to judge. Second of all, as far as I know, it's the only one that uses threads to do work in parallel. So it's kind of a bit like Rescue versus Sidekick in that matter. And I've been here for years, not planning to do any other stuff aside from security and Kafka. So I think I'm pretty reliable. I think I tackled majority of corner cases. And one thing that I'm super proud of, in 2.0, I wrote a lot of regression tests that actually talk with Kafka and do really weird stuff like processing data backwards, stuff you don't usually do, but stuff that proves that certain solutions are reliable enough to do weird stuff without breaking. So I encourage you to look at the 2.0 branch into specs, integrations. There, any corner case you can imagine, I think it's there. And if not, just open an issue and I will be happy to add it because it helps me as well.
So my follow-up question then is, because I've been looking forward to this in the Kafka space, is Kafka streams. Do you have any plans with Karafka to introduce something to wrap that?
Yeah, I do. I have a plan to introduce a pro version of Karafka, mainly to get some funding to get into Kafka streams. As long as I can get some funding to get some help from other people, other smart people, and I can use this money to invest into streams, yes, I have a plan to implement the streams API. Maybe not directly into Karafka, but as a part of the Karafka ecosystem.
Give this guy some money.
Depends on the
somebody give this guy some money. For those that don't know, Kafka streams are kind of a way to query against the live streaming data. It's really interesting. So hopefully you get to work on that, because I would love to take advantage of that.
Does that mean that instead of polling, then you're kind of connected to a WebSocket and you're just pulling stuff in all the time?
Well, it means you define a window on which you can operate like semi SQL queries, and you can get results out of it. So it's quite convenient to do certain operations, especially if you do in-memory processing with Kafka, Karafka, and things like that. For some of those things, you could easily just write streams, use Kafka streams, and not have certain overhead of running processes and complex stuff aside from business logic. So yeah, I would love to get into streams, but I do need some funding and help. That's why I'm going to have a pro of Karafka is going to be, I'm going to provide certain small features only for like super advanced users and ask for a bit of money. And obviously some consultancy hours are going to be involved in that. And I had a plan to reinvest 80% of that money into streams and 20% to give away to open source Karafka depends on. There are other open source projects and libraries that Karafka depends on. I just wanted to get this money to other people. So yeah. Interesting thing, all of the pro stuff is also going to be open source. So I didn't go with this approach that Mike has with Sidekick Pro, that you get a different URL from a different registry. I'm too lazy to maintain that, to keep SLAs and, make people rely on me. So all of the Karafka Pro code is in the same repository, in the same package. You just need to provide a license key. Technically speaking, you can just monkey patch the license check and you should be good to go. I don't think it's worth doing that because it's not going to be expensive. But if you would really want to, yeah, whatever. I'm not going to stop anyone from doing that.
It's a tough world. We're still trying to figure out how to make open source. We're still coming up with funding models. So yeah, it's tough.
It is. And, a lot of Ruby open source could be developed faster or better, or could go beyond certain limitations with a bit of funding, like the whole dry ecosystem, right? If Piotr Solnica could just work on dry stuff, we would have a lot of cool libraries. Or ROM. ROM is a great tool as well.
I'm a big fan of Peter Solnica's work. The ROM library changed the way I implement all of my databases on my platforms. Yes, I struggle to give open source developers money because I'm mean and selfish, but it's a different question. It's a different question if you're working in a massive company like Doximity. I mean, they must have money to burn, right, Valentino? they could just throw money at this problem straight away. And is that not the case?
The case with Doximity?
I'm joking. I'm joking. You don't have to answer that. You don't have to answer that.
I mean, we're small potatoes compared to some of the other giants like Shopify out there, right? With $1 trillion market caps. But
have you considered making it ransomware instead?
For what? You can make...
Ignore Luke.
Well, making...
It's the new trend.
Putting ransomware in it wouldn't make any sense because you can get much better return on investment by exploiting Ruby gems and NPM in other ways. So if we're talking about crypto mining, there are ways to get into more computers than just infecting Karafka with it. So no, I did not consider that. I did some extensive let's call it POCs in 2020 and 2021 to validate certain of my ideas in the security space. Yeah, you can do a lot of cool stuff. Illegal, semi-illegal, yeah.
On a slightly serious note, I was going to say, I have seen a glut of articles recently it feels like they're coming from the perspective of not a developer, where they're like, hey, there's like a problem in the open source community because look at this open source developer that messed with like Russian computers not too long ago. Look, they could be doing that to us, these developers, like they're not in control. And so I feel like there's a little bit of fear mongering going around, and I feel like sort of a bit of a call to action, in my opinion, like we as a collective developer group of people probably might want to like figure out what we want to do about open source before somebody comes knocking and says you need to do this because we want to control you. So I don't know, I kind of feel like there's probably some pressure to it's a hard problem, and I'm not like we haven't solved it yet, and we're a bunch of smart people, so obviously that means it's a very hard problem. But at the same time, I feel like other people want to get their hands in the cookie jar now, so it might be a thing that we should spend more of our time thinking about in our spare time. That's my thoughts on it.
We use open source. We don't want to pay anyone, and yet we have expectations towards people providing the open source to keep providing it, right? I have a lot of fun with Karafka. So the reason why I think about providing the pro version is not to get a lot of money, but to be able to invest in streams and other things. But I can totally imagine frustration of people spending a lot of time on their super popular open source and then asking for help and not getting any, right? And I think that the only reliable business model that would work is the one that Mike uses for Sidekick. Like, here's an open source library. If you need certain pro features or need a really good support, well, you need to pay. And I think it's a win-win. Companies get amazing software of a great quality. They get someone they know that is responsible for this software, which kind of minimizes the supply chain risk, at least for this library. They get someone they can trust. And the investment cost is like for Sidekick, what, $50 a month? 1 hour of a average software developer to get something like that. So yeah, if we're talking about this open source supply chain problem, this is a big problem. And someone is knocking on our doors. Last year, the Biden administrator released, what was it called? The executive order on software security that will slowly impose certain regulations on anyone that wants to build software for US government, right? We're starting with software bill of materials, SBOM, which is just a really long list of all of your dependencies and their states, and you will have to provide that to the US government, right? But slowly we're going to get into this, hopefully not over-regulated, but definitely regulated world where, yeah, open source is not only going to be seen as a benefit, but also as a big risk. That's one part of the story. The second is the more stuff we regulate in open source space, the less space we have for new open source, creative open source, because it's going to be really hard for people to get their open source software used, right? I think Google had this idea that maintainers of popular packages should be publicly known, or they should be at least, listed with their names or something like that. And not everyone wants that. I can totally imagine a world where you either do that or no one is allowed to use your open source. So even if you have even if you release Kafka streams, right? To Ruby, no one may be able to use that because you don't want to comply with regulations that would impose on you certain legal risks while you're not being paid for that. You're just a dude from Poland doing some funny open source and MIT, GPL, no warranties, no strings attached. Sorry. And then suddenly, no Kafka streams for your company or actually anyone else aside from other open source projects. So I don't know if I don't know if our direction is good, the direction where we are going with open source, but we'll see.
I mean, I would actually agree with you, but so I didn't realize we were going to dive too philosophical, but I mean, I would definitely, my opinion is that we need to get more developers like involved with like governance, right? Like whether that's in Congress or whatever, because I feel like there's a whole bunch of people that have no idea, like all the stuff that we do every day, like trying to tell us what to do. And that scares me. But yeah, okay, we can move on.
I'm quite optimistic on Biden's administrative. At least so far, their ideas are solid. Whether they contradict open source openness and, do whatever you want, risk is on you. That's not me to decide, but yeah, we'll see. Some regulations need to happen because developers don't care about security. They don't want to do it. It's pretty much like concurrency, Dave, right? You just want to have it all done. You want someone to take care of that. You just want to focus on doing your work.
Exactly.
I did want to respond a little bit to that about the not caring about security, because I think that sometimes it can be taken in a derogatory, and I don't think it should. Like, I don't think that developers are paid to care about security. Mm-hmm. Just like I don't think developers are paid, for example, they're not paid to do sysadmin work and things like this, which is like why when you're leaning on developers to care about like DevOps side of things, security side of things, like that's the wrong way to do it, because you're paying them to deliver results, not to care about the security. So you'll have misaligned incentives, misaligned expectations, and things like that. So I definitely think that unless you are specifically paying a developer to care about that stuff, in which case their velocity is always going to be lower, right? Because they're going to spend a lot of that velocity on thinking and trying to create walls and protect and things like that. Unless you explicitly make that part of their job description, they can't, because that's not what they're being judged on, and therefore that's not what they're being paid on. So I definitely think we have to just be careful about like
Yeah.
There's like a bare minimum. You don't want your developer to like, be like, all right, I'm gonna get Rails out of the box and I'm gonna turn off CRF tokens and I'm gonna turn off like every other security feature in there. I think that's a base level expectation that you can have. But beyond that, like, I don't think you can expect your developer to be on top of every security bulletin all the time. They're gonna catch the ones that hit their inbox, maybe. But I think anyway, I'm sure that there are other opinions around the table.
You're right. No, in my opinion, you're absolutely right. I may have stated that in a different way. They don't care because it's not their job. Let's put it that way, right? If the expectation is on delivering, obviously security is not their concern. And maybe if they would care more about security, they would be in a DevSecOps space, not in a software development space. So maybe that's the reason. But what I also notice is that even the bare minimum, setting up open source free tools when you're working on it in a small startup where you don't have extensive pen testing team, you don't have DevSecOps team, you don't have a DevOps, you just deploy to Heroku or somewhere. Even then, you should have at least a bit of a security mindset. But when I talk with people, they have software a lot of CVEs, high severity, critical severity CVEs, exploitable ones. And they're like, yeah, we don't store sensitive data. What can happen? Oh yeah, someone will mine cryptocurrency on our computers. We'll just restart that. So I think, yeah.
Yeah. I think it's a fine line to walk because we do need, as developers, and I do think we do bear a certain level of responsibility around security. And so if you're developing a microservices app and you are exposing every single one of your microservices with a FQDN, just so it's easier for you to talk between the microservices, well, then you are increasing your service level exposure or your service level attack. And I think that's something that the developers should keep in mind as they're developing what the best practices are, what the OWASP top 10 are. They're running Brakeman on every commit or push. And if they're not doing those kind of things, then you will eventually get yourself into a bad situation that then has to be explained to less techie people who are very angry that their information got taken or something else.
Hang on, what should I be running on every commit? Rackman?
Brakeman.
What's that? What is it?
Are you serious, sir?
Yeah, I don't know what it is. What's that?
Put the brakes on your coding, Luke.
It's a static code analyzer that will basically just look at your code to see if there's any obvious vulnerabilities. And it's really helpful to, point out some insecure, like file access type things that you might have. So it's a good thing to run on your code base.
No, I don't do that at all. And I do a lot of commits. I've got to go and run it a load of times.
What I do is I have it as part of my CI/CD pipeline. So if there is something that gets flagged there, then I actively have to look at it before I can merge into my main branch.
Hi, this is Charles Max Wood from Top End Devs. And lately I've been coaching some people on starting some podcasts and in some cases just taking their career to the next level. Whether you're beginner going to intermediate going to advanced, whether you're trying to get noticed in the community or go freelance, I've been helping these folks figure out how to get in front of people, how to build relationships and how to build their careers and max out and just go to the next level. So if you're interested in talking to me and having me help you go to the next level, go to topenddevs.com/coaching. I will give you a 1-hour free session where we can figure out what you're trying to do, where you're trying to go, and figure out what the next steps are. And then from there, we can figure out how to get you to the place you want to go. So once again, that's topenddevs.com/coaching.
I think what I was kind of trying to get is I think that everyone has a different set of expectations for what they think people should be doing. And I think that like we often are very judgmental about like, well, they should have done that or they should have done this. And like, my point is like, I think that if you want a developer or team of developers to care about security, you probably need to explicitly tell them and let them know that you're paying them, right? to achieve some level of expectations. Like personally, like what I tell people and what I try to do is I care about the OWASP top 10. So I thought it was awesome that you brought that up, Dave. I care about the OWASP top 10. If I am caring and take care of the OWASP top 10, then I feel like I have met a reasonable level of security. And yes, could there be 0 days and other things that like maybe my system could have vulnerabilities? Yes, that's true. But like, since I typically don't get very clear and defined expectations from the people that I'm doing work for, that's the level that I hold myself to, because I feel like it's a reasonable level. Also, I think that Rails basically comes out of the box giving you stuff that helps you handle all of it pretty much. So, and it's always been that way. And I feel like I don't have to really work very hard to achieve the OWASP top 10. So it's a low level, good, like it's low risk, high reward, right? So that's how I feel about it. And that's the expectation that I hold myself to. But I think the thing that I was really getting at is like, I think that we judge other developers, and people who are non-developers judge developers, and they're like, oh, they should have known about that thing. And I'm like, okay, if it wasn't on the OWASP top 10 list, or if it wasn't, I mean, even if it's not, like, did you explicitly tell them that that was your expectation? Because there's so many vulnerabilities, and security is totally a game of like lots of work for small wins. Go ahead, Dave.
Let's take a fun example, because this is a double-edged sword. You're going to get hurt one way or the other. You just have to be careful when you're playing with these swords. So if you have a project and you let the gem file, or rather the gem file lock, just kind of sit there forever, you never run bundler audit to see if there are any gems with known CVEs that have been patched, and you just never update your gems because your train of thought is everything was working, everything was secure at the time that we started using that gem, so we're not going to touch it. Or maybe you're just too afraid to touch them and update your gems because the whole house of cards will come crumbling down. Different set of problems. But let's say you never update your gems. Well, then you are exposing yourself to potential zero-day exploits or other vulnerabilities that can make your application compromised. But on the other hand, if you just run bundler update or bundle update all the time, every single time, before you do a push, and you just do a quick regression to make sure it didn't break anything. So, your application code, there's no errors there. But what you don't know is, are you pulling in an updated gem that has been compromised? So maybe someone else has compromised the gem. It could be a popular one. It may not be. And then now you're bringing in an exploit into your application. So I think we have to walk this fine line of security where we're not leaving things so out of date that they become easily exploitable, and we're not updating too fast or deploying too fast to where we are just, without knowing, bringing in exploits.
I think we're on the cusp of a huge shift in open source, really, but in software in general, right? Where right now, GitHub has been really great with passive security, right? Like introducing security scanning tools. I mean, other companies do this as well, but you just upload your code and it scans it for you. There's all these bundler checks so you can audit the dependencies. There's all these passive things that you can do retroactively to monitor how secure maybe some of the stuff that you're using is. And what I'm excited for is kind of like the active security, right? Or responsiveness of security, updates. So say like, an exploit is found, that alert goes out to a public security forum and something happens. Your code is analyzed and maybe fixed or something like that. That whole pathway is kind of missing. And I'm kind of curious to see what your guys' thoughts are on that. Like, what do you see as missing or can be done to kind of lead us there where, you no longer, because we have like Dependabot, right? Or some kind of bot that could say, hey, this gem that you're using has a patch. Here it is, merge it if you want. And you wait for the test to run, but you take the risk, updating any dependency, any code, that it could break something the way that you're using it, right? So you take the risk updating for security, the behest of whatever tests you might be missing or cases for your use case. So Well, I mean, what are your guys' thoughts are on kind of like that more active approach of security?
Do you guys know about Renovate?
Nope.
Renovate is an open source, a quite big project. It's actually a competitor to Dependabot. And it has something called merge confidence. So whenever it opens a pull request to update dependencies, it will tell you based on other projects that use the same dependency, whether with what confidence it did or did not break other people's specs. And it uses certain heuristics and stuff like that to figure that out. So whenever it opens a pull request, you'll get an info that, hey, this is probably not going to break anything. Your specs are running, other people's specs are running, other open source project specs are running. It shouldn't be a major change, or the other way around. Hey, this pull request will fix the CVE, but it also requires your attention. It will require your investment, right? And I think it's Renovate with this and a couple other features. I think it's a really good project, definitely worth checking out.
That's interesting.
In my opinion, the only thing that is missing is awareness that there are so many free or open source tools that you can use that are just plug and play, and that with certain confidence will mitigate your problems without introducing others, right? Like Valentino, like you said, you probably don't want to compromise stability of the system in exchange for security
So I'm curious what other ways, maybe things that are missing. And, I'm thinking, more of like just being able to automatically adjust outside of alerting, right? Because right now the focus has been on alerting and monitoring kind of thing. So I feel like there's just a huge missing space there of applying patches or retroactively including just the small pieces that maybe have been fixed.
Well, you can set it up. You can set up many tools to work automatically, but would you be willing to take the risk? It's 2 a.m. and you have this low risk update that is auto merged and, auto propagated to staging and then to a deployment. Would you be willing to take the risk? I would be only for critical CVEs that are exploitable in my system. For stuff like that, definitely I would be. Let's take Log4j, right? That happened what, month ago, 1.5 months ago? I don't know if you guys are familiar with Log4j.
It was December.
Wasn't that like 6 months ago? I feel like that happened around Christmas time.
It was December 2021.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. It was a short. I get it. It was yeah.
Yeah. So for people that don't know, you could just build a string that would allow you to run any arbitrary code on the server that would receive this. That would use this really popular package called Log4j for Java. And yeah, for stuff like this, I would definitely be able to take the risk of having it auto-mitigated, auto-updated, auto-deployed. But for less risky stuff, I still wouldn't feel fully confident, open source project, updating my open source project.
I guess it would depend, right? Like, is it something that's like, manage? Is it on the Kubernetes level, right? Is it managing a bunch of resources that you're making available? Or is it like something, on an application layer where you can apply, hey, only apply this to X number of users kind of thing? Can you shard the process? Not shard it, but can you separate the process and isolate the node to only deliver to so many people so that you can say, okay, we can gain more confidence the longer that it's out. I feel like there's just there's a bunch of tools that I feel like maybe exist, just there's no coordination. There's nothing where you could say, hey, here's a security fix, put it in your pipeline kind of thing. There's no pipeline. It's like everybody has their own kind of system.
Yeah, and I think that we'd all be very fearful of somebody creating that pipeline too. I mean, maybe if GitHub came out tomorrow and was like, hey, if you just install this in your app, then you'll get free security updates and we'll handle all the risk for you. And like, I feel like some of us might take advantage of it, but I feel like basically anyone else, we're all going to be like, so what's your angle here? And like, how much money am I going to have to pay you? And
think about Heroku, right? Think about all of these hosting providers. They do that, right? And I mean, I know they own the systems, but at the same time, you use AWS too, and they own those systems. And there's a huge population of the internet on AWS and any number of these other, platforms that, maybe could take advantage of something of this nature.
Well, I mean, you look at the SolarWinds
Would you
breach,
trust that
right?
too? Yeah.
I mean, SolarWinds was legitimately security software, right? And they got compromised. And it compromised everybody they were managing security for. And so it's, and I'm not picking on security software. I'm just saying nothing is foolproof, right? Nothing that you're going to put out there that's going to manage these kinds of things is going to 100% solve the problem. And the other thing, and I'm sure this has been brought up over and over again, is just feels like it's an escalating war. We figure these things out, and then they figure these things out, and then we take things to the next level. And so, yeah, we figure out, okay, we're watching for these kinds of exploits now, and so they're just going to find another way in. And so you have to be paying attention.
It works that way. I can assure you. I can see how when we build security detection tools in white source or security detection tools for Defend, when you build certain stuff and you start reporting incidents to NPM or Ruby Gems or other vendors or companies, and those packages are taken down, you see how the attackers evolve. They know it's not going to, this approach is no longer going to work. A great example of it were hooks. For NPM and Ruby Gems, you have those post-install or pre-install hooks. You can basically run code upon install of a package, right? And attackers used to use that to build reverse shells or collect data, right? But now more and more companies are looking into what is being executed when you install stuff, or they actually prohibit any stuff from being executed when you install it. And a couple of days ago, I've seen few new packages having the remote code execution shells, but only when you start using the software itself, right? So the probability that it's going to be stopped early goes down. And many things that the attackers change based on how and what we detect, how they play around publishing useless, semi-useless packages, like packages no one will use, called please don't install me test.1, whatever, right? They upload stuff like that with malicious content, and they see which one of them is going to stick. They're not going to use a certain vector of attack if it's going to be taken down in an hour by NPM. But if it's there for a month or a year, the probability that someone will detect it is lower. So you probably want to go with this exploit instead of others that were taken down. And it is happening every single day. Every single day, we report at least 10 packages to NPM.
Hang on, is this part of the Defend system?
Mm-hmm.
What is the Defend system? I've had a look, and it seems to be a way of detecting ASCII art in open source. But does it do other stuff as well?
Yes, it's one of the features. No, Defend is an open source supply chain platform. So it is combined out of two things. One is the detection engine that we use to detect malicious package versions. We scan every single version of every single package that is being released to NPM and Ruby Gems, and we make sure it is not malicious. And the second thing is the API part, where you can connect your bundler or NPM or Yarn and make sure that when you run install command or update, that you don't get something fishy, basically. So we detect something. When we detect something, we flag it. We report it to NPM or Ruby Gems. It takes some time for packages to be taken down. NPM has a different policies than Ruby Gems, right? There's always a window where the package can be downloaded. And even if it's taken down, you have caches, you have Docker, you can have like multiple layers of caches where this package can stay sometimes for months. And Defend just makes sure you don't run weird stuff like that.
How does it work? There must be some kind of static code analysis. Is there any other kind of secret neural deep learning open stuff in there?
Well, if there wouldn't be, no one would buy it from me, right?
Right.
and it was acquired. So first of all, we find a lot of stuff. I think now it's more than 16,000 package versions that we detected and reported for the last 1 year, 1.5 years. The way it works is proprietary, but
does it use a lot of Kafka?
As much, actually, no, it doesn't use Kafka at all. But I'm lazy. I picked stuff that I need to get job done. We do a lot of stuff. We do static code analysis. We do behavior analysis. We analyze how the package versions behave and how they behave in correlation to the previous versions. We analyze other packages of the same users. We build up like network of dependencies, and we try to understand whether there's a deviation in a behavior of a package or behavior of the owners or the publisher, or is there any change in the ecosystem that would indicate that something is not right? An abstract answer, but pretty much, explains what Defend does. Each time you release a package, Defend will pick it up and look at it.
I've got a follow-up question. In some parts of the world, some parts which are getting closer and closer, people don't enjoy the same freedoms that we do. And technology is highly controlled, highly censored, especially regarding access to information. And a system that can check very successfully for software vulnerabilities could conceivably check for forbidden encryption methods, firewall bypassing utilities. And we've all seen code, actively removed from GitHub in particular, to try and punch through the Great Firewall of China. So people do have free access to information. Are you worried at all that the same tool that can be used to look for code vulnerabilities could eventually be used to restrict the freedom of developers to code?
It's a complex question because you have freedom of developers to be able to code, and then you have certain risks associated with using open source of certain people from certain countries, right? So I think that there definitely should be a lot of freedom for people to build what they want and do what they want with it, as long as it's not causing any harm or not serving evil intent. But at the same time, I believe that companies should be aware and should have right to be aware that certain pieces of software come from certain countries or certain areas, right? Because I can totally see a case where someone is being forced by a government or an entity to put certain pieces of non-exactly legit software into the really popular open source to cause harm to someone at the other end of the world. And I strongly believe that you should be able to do assessment of risk when you use any type of open source or any type of software, actually, right? This is where we should go with SBOM, that you're not only able to get a list of software, you should be able to run analysis on the risks a given piece of software brings to your organization.
Yeah, and you could pay for closed source software that could also cause harm.
Right?
If you use it a specific way, right? So I don't know that open source is any more vulnerable than any other type of source. It's
well, I think we're moving towards a world where we don't just have open source, but we have approved source. Certainly, I think we all are old enough to remember when it was illegal to export cryptography from the United States. That was the case right the way up to the 90s. And now we view cryptography as a kind of almost a human right. It is a human right, a right to privacy. So this doesn't just affect people, in more notorious regimes. It also affects, certainly me in England. So I think this is a brilliant tool and really, really good if you're worried about your open source packages and forming more secure software supply chain. But I don't think you can separate malicious code from government forbidden code. I think those two are indistinguishable.
Well, they're both malicious. I guess that.
Whoa, careful now.
No, I think that open source to some gives a false sense of security. Hey, it's open source. Everyone is looking at it. If something would be there, someone would find it, right? It's not that easy because for some software, you need to be an expert. You need to have a domain knowledge to actually understand the complexity of the software. And this, like with Kafka, Karafka, this open sourceness just isn't as expected. It's not everyone being able to look at it, find bugs, report security issues. On the other hand, we could say the same about proprietary software, right? It gives you a false sense of security because there's a big company behind that. You're paying them a lot of money. So their security team is definitely the best one you can get. Yeah, I don't think there's a silver bullet to tackle all of the problems. Supply chain is becoming a hot topic, whether we're talking about the open source supply chain or the proprietary supply chain components, Docker scanning, proprietary component scanning and things like that, or just making sure that you use legit packages. There's still a lot of things to be done.
Yep. I'm going to push us toward picks here, unless there's something else that we absolutely need to cover as part of this topic. Everyone got real quiet. So I'm going to assume that we've more or less covered the topic. We should probably just bring this up periodically because I think it's a topic that's going to become more and more relevant as time goes on. People are just finding new ways to exploit software. But yeah, let's go ahead and do picks, and then we'll wrap up. Hey, folks, if you love this podcast and would like to support the show, or if you wish you could listen without the sponsorship messages, then you're in luck. We're setting up new premium podcast feeds where you can get all of the episodes released after Christmas 2020 without the ads. Signing up will help us pay for editing and production, and you can go sign up at devchat.tv/premium. Let's have Dave start us off with picks.
All right. Well, I don't really have any great picks, so I'm going to pick this stupid thing. So I have a direct attached storage for my Mac, and it does my time machine. It's a backup storage and all that good stuff. So the problem is it's a bit noisy, and I want it away from my desk. And I did not want to spend $600 for a fiber optic Thunderbolt cable. So Apple recently released a 3-meter Thunderbolt cable, and it actually works. I'm able to get it up and away from my desk. I have it put away on a shelf, and I don't even hear it now. So I'm going to pick the $150 some odd 3-meter Thunderbolt cable.
That is a long
it's actually
cable.
It is, especially for Thunderbolt. And it's actually not a horrible price for Thunderbolt cables, because those in nature are just very expensive anyways.
Cool. John, what are your picks?
Okay, so I have 2 picks. One of them kind of came up today. So my first pick, I'm just going to go ahead and be like, hey, if you're not familiar with, you should become familiar with and care about the OWASP 10. I think in my opinion, it's a pretty good standard for like you as a web developer specifically. I mean, there are other lists for like if you're not a web developer or whatever, but the OWASP 10 is for web development or whatever mostly. It's just a pretty good, I guess, standard to hold yourself to or whatever. I guess, in my opinion, I feel pretty proud. Like, I'm like, all right, I've handled this much. Like, yeah, that doesn't mean that my app is perfectly secure or anything, but it means that I can at least go to sleep at night without freaking out about it or whatever. And I at least have a good way of like, when somebody's like, hey, are you caring about this thing? I can be like, well, if that's the thing that you care about, let's make that part of, whatever, like our contract or part of my job description, blah, blah, blah. Like if that's an expectation that you have, maybe we can add it in. But yeah, this is at least like, I feel like what I can hold myself to when expectations are not explicit. And then for my second pick, I have just been back into my Scotch kick. Scotch is still extremely expensive over here, but prices have come a little bit down from when they were in COVID. And so I've been picking up some more Scotches, and I have been thoroughly enjoying my Abenad this past week, which is an Aberlour. So it's Aberlour Abenad. It's like a cask strength kind of thing, which has kind of become a little bit popular over here in the whiskeys over here in the US or whatever. But before that happened, this was like, if you were like, hey, I want something spicy, this is like what any Scotch person would like recommend to you. And it's really awesome and pretty consistently good. So each batch is a little bit different. So there are some batches that are like very expensive because everybody wants it. And there are some batches that are not quite as good, but for the most part, they're almost all very good. Those are my 2 picks.
Nice. Valentino, what are your picks?
So my first 2 picks are 2 open source projects we just released at Doximity. The first one's called Simple Kick. It basically lets you orchestrate a series of Sidekick jobs for Sidekick Pro. So if you have a pipeline of jobs that depend on each other, it just lets you orchestrate that in an easy to read single Ruby file. We've been using it. It's working really awesome to make sense of of the mess that you can make with Sidekick. And the other one is, it's really cool GitHub action that basically just lets you extract a list of file names from a commit SHA or pull request and perform some function on it. So we use that to, as an example, run just specs on a specific diff that was made when you're creating a pull request, and a bunch of other related things for GraphQL as an example, just to generate regenerate a schema for whatever's files have been touched. So definitely go check that out. It's GitHub Action callback list files. And then the next one is kind of just like a Ruby Gems announcement. There's a proposal up for scoped gems, which I think is pretty interesting. I would definitely recommend weighing in on that, checking out the proposal. It gives you that kind of not to shout out to JavaScript, but npm packages that have the @ symbol. It's definitely convenient and lets you have any named gem you want within a higher level tier.
It will bring mess. It will be a crazy time when we adopt namespaces for a while, because people won't know whether they should go with Rails or at Rails/Rails and so on. So it's going to be a huge field for exploitation for actors.
I'm going to register the namespace JavaScript sucks and just copy everyone's gems into that.
At Chuck/Rocks. I like that. Anyway, Luke, what are your picks?
Oh, Matt, well, there's this really good article by this guy called Maciej Mensfeld about reducing your method calls using an example using the thread.parse. And this is a really interesting article because I actually wrote a queue system like that when I was working in a job in Japan, parallelizing jobs on my Mac, and I had image rendering, and I had hundreds of images. And every time I made a mistake, which is like a lot, the job had to rerun. It took 20 minutes to rerun. So I kind of got really into the queue class and semaphores and came up with something. And this article by this Mensfeld guy kind of delves into that in a lot more detail, and it really talks about the trade-offs between queuing jobs. That's my first pick. My second pick is using JSON-B in Postgres using Jeremy Evans SQL Gem. We've got a really big logging system at work that chugs through a lot of data, and it's all numeric, and you end up with squillions of rows. And I'm looking at reducing overheads by putting more data into one row, right? So there's just less churn. Relational databases apparently aren't supposed to do this because of normalization and stuff, but I want to do it, so I'm doing it. It's a very powerful technique using JSON-B, but it is very tricky, and I'm still really struggling with how to make efficient queries with structured data in databases. And it's coming from a Rails background, you're used to all this stuff being abstracted away from you. So it's been really challenging getting into using these advanced database features, but really interesting and really huge performance gains. Like you were talking about earlier, getting kind of 100 times, 1,000 times performance gains. If you can leverage these more advanced features of the systems you're using, you can really transform their performance. So that's me.
Hey, Chuck. I just remembered I had another pick that Luke reminded me of.
Do it.
I have an M1 machine. That's what most of my development machines are, desktop and laptop. And I recently had to build for x86 images for Docker. And if you've never tried doing that, it is a painful...
I have done it.
process.
I've done it. It's really slow.
It is extremely slow because of the processor architecture emulation. So I recently discovered that with the Docker build X command, you can pass in a flag called builder, and you can set up this builder to a remote x86 Docker install on your network or a remote network. So all your code remains on your local machine, but it will use the Docker engine of the remote host to actually do all of the building of that image. And so by doing that, I was able to shave off minutes of my build time of the images I was having to create. And so it doesn't interrupt your workflow at all. You just pass in one additional flag into your Docker build command. So I wrote up an article on it, and so I'm going to pick that article.
All right. Well, yeah, let's share that so people can find it. I'm going to jump in here with a couple of picks. The first one is I've been picking board games, and I'm going to start on Legendary. So Legendary, this is the Marvel Legendary. There are other versions for other TV franchise and comic book franchises. But the Marvel one is a lot of fun. There are a whole bunch of expansions for it. I'm probably going to wind up using up the expansions for the next 6 or 7 weeks just to kind of talk through them. But initially, you kind of get the core comic book characters that you're probably most familiar with from the Avengers movies and stuff in the legendary game. And it's a ton of fun to play. I always look it up on Board Game Geek to get you the game weight. And this particular game, I'm still waiting for it to come up here. It is a 2.44. So, it's a reasonably involved game, but it doesn't have so many rules that it's hard to follow. So I'm going to pick that. And then I'm also just going to shout out about, so how do I put it? I've been using NetFTP, which is a Ruby core library, to do some of the work. Basically, the way that the podcast universe works is that almost all your hosting for media files, you upload over FTP, like it or hate it. And so I've been working out a system where people can upload over the internet and then not have to use an insecure protocol. I'll use the insecure protocol for them and programmatically push the files up. And so that's been kind of interesting, just to kind of work my way around. But then I can put all the credentials into environment variables and manage all that stuff in a little bit more secure way instead of having the traffic sniffed by whoever's sitting there sniffing. So I'm using that for Top End Devs and Podcast Playbook. And so I'm going to pick that. And then the last one I'm going to shout out about, and this is kind of a half-hearted pick, but it's domainagents.com. So a while back, I bought podcastplaybook.co because podcastplaybook.com was owned by somebody else. And so I went and I tried to buy the other domain. And so the upside of using somebody like Domain Agents is that I found that people are sometimes more willing to deal with them than they are to deal with, some person on the internet they don't know and worry about whether or not it's a scam or, that I'm trying to, play off something. The other thing that's nice about it is that they use escrow.com to facilitate the domain transfer. So I own podcastplaybook.com now, and that all worked out. The only problems I really had with it were that the negotiation mechanisms aren't really super well fleshed out. And so I offered a payment plan, and then when things went through for the purchase, it turned out that they didn't put in the payment plan. And it's because I had put the offer in as a full payment offer, and then explained that I wanted to do installments. And anyway, it turned into this thing. The other issue that I had was that as part of the escrow thing, effectively what they had to do was give you I don't know if you've ever transferred a domain from somebody else. If you buy it with your own on the registrar and it's unowned, then it just shows up in your account. But otherwise, you have to have a code that will allow you to transfer the domain. And I've done this a handful of times with different things. But effectively, what you're doing then is what's held in escrow is that transfer code. And I actually had to bug them a handful of times to get it, even though it was part of the escrow system. The flip side is that it worked. So if you're trying to find somebody who can act as kind of a reliable third party for a domain purchase, they're who I used and they were okay. So it doesn't sound like a glowing review, and it's not, but it worked. So there you go. Maciej, what are your picks?
My pick is rather funny because I pick a 25-cent US dollar resistor that can fix Intel CPU. I have a Synology NAS. I think it's like 4 years old, so it's still quite fresh. It gets all of the updates and so on, but it stopped working. And it turns out that, Intel developed a CPU that wasn't meant to last too long, and it would stop working. It basically would not boot. But with this single resistor that is soldered into the motherboard, it just starts working again. So 25 cents, and you save $1,500 on a network access storage. So that's definitely my pick. 100 ohms, 0.5 watt.
Nice. All right. Are those all your picks? Do you want to tell people where to find you online?
Yeah, you can type my surname, mensfeld.pl. That's where I stay pretty much all the time. You can find me on Twitter, though. You can find me on Twitter as well. And you can check out the defend.io project. I highly recommend it.
Can we contact you by copy-pasting ASCII, Skull and Bones into our open source projects and leaving you a little message?
Well, yeah, you can try. I don't pick all of the ASCII stuff. There are people that host their images on NPM, uploading like gigabyte package that only stores some weird images. So I definitely don't check all of the ASCII because majority of it isn't malicious. But if you start doing something fishy, there's high probability I will be able to contact you. I did find a security researcher that got into a really big company that didn't want to be found. And he was really surprised when I messaged him on LinkedIn, like, hey, dude, do you know what you did? And he was like, oh, fuck. How did you get my contact? And it turns out I was able to track him down because 1 year ago, he owned a package with someone else. So I pinged this someone else and they had Slack history and they didn't have his email or anything like that, but he had an avatar. So I used Google image reverse search for this avatar, and there was a Twitter profile. Based on the name, I was able to go to GitHub, and based on that, I found a guy on LinkedIn. He wasn't happy about it.
Well, if you don't want to be found on the internet, being found on the internet's problematic, I guess.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we're going to go ahead and wrap up here. Thanks for coming. And until next time, folks, Max out.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.